Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm Abby Dauber-Stern, Director of Makom, the Jewish Agency for Israel Education Lab. Happy sixth day or seventh night, or sorry, it's the seventh day or eighth night of Hanukkah tonight. And we're glad so many of you are here to join us. Before I get started, I know who most of you are because I saw the registration list, but my hunch is that not all of you know who each other is, and we don't have time to go through the whole list, but I'd love if you could start chatting into the chat box. Say what your title is or your organizational affiliation and what city you are in. So your job title or organizational affiliation, if you have one, and what city you're sitting in. Start sending those chats over so we can all see, and I will jump into the program. So this is what we're going to do as I share my screen. Here we go. Okay. First, I'm going to give you an overview of what we're doing today, so you have a sense of what the next few hours will look like, and then I'll tell you about the program itself. So we'll have words from Amira Aronovich, the Director General of the Jewish Agency for Israel. We're then going to get deep into the content. We're going to actually hear from participants, recordings of participants, and Dr. Alex Thompson of Rosov Consulting will help us analyze what we're seeing and what we're hearing. We'll have breakout rooms to talk about them. We'll gather the responses, and we'll hear from our colleague, Roe Kruvi, our partner at Moishe House. We'll then have a half an hour break from 10:15 to 10:45. We're going to try really hard to stick to that. So you have time to check your email and do all the things you need to do, go to the bathroom, etc. And then the second half, we'll come back and we'll have a chance to actually hear some of our own insights from Robbie Greengrass, who we just heard from, who's the lead educator on this project. We'll really get to hear what we learned, what we think others can learn as well. And then we'll go back into breakout rooms and we'll gather responses again, get a chance to hear from all of you. So I'm first going to tell you a little bit about this project because you probably don't know much about the Moishe House Makom collaboration. So the project was started in May 2017 when Makom, then led by Johnny Ariel, submitted a proposal to the Jim Joseph Foundation. So to quote Johnny, who I don't think is on the call today, but he was, we had another one of these yesterday. I'm going to quote Johnny, you can see what's on the screen here. It's from a book that he edited. That's, by the way, available on Kindle. And he wrote that Makom, and in fact, this project, was constructed on three interlocking assumptions. One is that Israel has changed radically in the last few decades. Two is that Jewish identity has changed radically in the last few decades. And three, education has changed radically in the last few decades. And of course, the obvious question is, shouldn't Israel education do the same? And so this project sought to work with Moishe House residents and leadership to engage them in Israel education. As you know, Moishe House residents are charged with leading programs for their friends. And as you also might know, that generally these programs are mostly social in nature without too much content or depth. I wouldn't say always, but that's often true at Moishe House. And so by embarking on this partnership with Makom, Moishe House was acknowledging that if they're going to engage in Israel, we probably are going to need to get a little deeper and a little bit more complicated. And for our part at Makom, we probably didn't realize the extent of the challenge, that it could be, right? The two very different organizations coming together, one that's like ours focused deeply on content, and the other that's focused much more on the social aspects, and how you bring those two together. So I'll tell you what the program goals were. One was to train Moishe House residents and staff to lead programs and conversations about Israel. Two was to nurture an organizational culture of robust and engaging Israel conversations, right, which I just indicated wasn't happening before. And three, to share what we learned through this process, which is really what today is about. And again, just to highlight that one of the fascinating things here for us was the cultural differences between Makom and Moishe House. And I'll just say very briefly that the Jim Joseph Foundation, who funded this whole project, and specifically Stephen Green, really was there to hold our hand. And we like to joke that he was our marriage counselor, taking two organizations that had great reason to work together, but also had some serious challenges in thinking about how they were going to do that, given the different cultures of the organizations. And Stephen was really a model for, I think, for how foundations could work with organizations and sort of helping us House and figure out how that relationship was going to work. Of course, we all had the best intentions, but there were challenges, and that was very exciting. Okay, so those are the three project goals. So what was the project structure? What did it look like? First, there was a framework, which we call 4 Hatikva questions, 4HQ. This is, on one foot, this is a framework that takes the words from Israel's national anthem, Liot Am Chofshi Be'artzenu, to be a people free in our land, and asks 4 existential questions. What does it mean to be? What does it mean to be a people? What does it mean to be free? And what does it mean to be in our land? Through these 4 questions, we taught and trained Moishe House folks, not only content about Israel, but also how to lead programs and conversations about Israel. Can get a lot more into what the 4HQ framework looks like. I won't today. We have loads of obviously educational materials, use it not only with Moishe House, but we use it quite often. But one of the interesting things also to say about the 4 Hatikva questions is they're questions, they're not answers. And we'll hear more about that later, the importance of framing the whole thing as questions. And as you see here, the structure of the program beyond the 4 Hatikva questions was a week seminar in Israel, a weekend retreat in the US, individual mentor meetings. Thanks, shout out to all the mentors who are on the call tonight. Ongoing current affairs and cultural materials that we wrote specially for them and sent to them, to the participants, microgrants for programming, a special website dedicated for Israel programming resources, and webinars throughout the year. And so here are some of our top line outcomes. So you see what what came out of it. We've worked with 72 Moishe House programmers and staff. Programmers meaning both residents and what's called Moishe House MHWOW hosts. Their hosts are different than residents. We can hear more about that from our colleagues in Moishe House. They ran over 200 new programs, including Israeli elections, COVID-19 in Israel, Ethiopian journey, seltzer beer, and wine over the green line, et cetera. You can see a real range from serious to fun, et cetera. They had about average of 9 participants per program. And of course, we have a lot more to say about the insights we shared, but that's some of the top line, what happened. It's very important to say. I'll just add, I see I missed, no, it's gone. I had a big COVID icon that came out, but basically I do want to name that COVID-19 happens, of course, in the middle of the second program year. And amazingly enough, on the one hand, things continued. And of course, the numbers would have been even higher had it not been for COVID-19. That's top line. I know that I've left a lot of things out and you're probably wondering, wait a second, I want to know what they did on what the itinerary of the trip was, or tell us more about what you did on the retreat. We'll get to bits and pieces of it. We're not going to go in depth into the program tonight. We'll be able to send that to you after this call, because tonight is really, or today for most of you, today is really the day to hear what we learned rather than into the details of the program. Okay, so we're going to transition to Dr. Alex Thompson, who's going to tell us a little bit about what we've learned. And we're going to hear from participants directly. And before we do that, I'll just say one word about who some of our participants were. I mentioned earlier, right, that they're Moishe House residents, Moishe House Without Walls hosts, and also a few Moishe House staff. They are quite diverse in their Jewish backgrounds. Some of them have what we would traditionally, say strong Jewish backgrounds. Some had less of a Jewish education. All have been to Birthright, and we also made it a requirement that they were had one additional trip to Israel, so that they had slightly more Israel experience. We also had them take a quiz, which we can send you later. It's on our website. We had them take a quiz on Israel content and as well. And they could take it as many times as they wanted until they did well on it. So it was both an educational experience and a way of doing some vetting and sending a message about how serious this was going to be. So with that, Dr. Alex, please.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you for the opportunity to share our work with you. And I also want to say a special thank you to my colleagues, Nettie Aharon, Ariel Platt, Natasha Nefedjeva, a former Moishe House resident herself, for gathering the data that we're going to be sharing with you today. As you'll see, this work, let me just try and share my screen with you. One moment. Here we go. Here we go. Hopefully you're seeing that. this work began with the following task. We, the team at Rosov Consulting, were asked to assess the extent to which this 4HQ initiative contributes to a change in how members of the Moishe House community talk about and develop programming about Israel. Our job was to see in what ways do the participants in this program grow, and do they feel more able, and in fact, do they engage in more facilitation, deeper facilitation of increasingly, let's say, complex conversations about Israel. While doing this work, we gathered some fascinating data. The data was gathered in the following fashion. First of all, and primarily through interviews with a sample of participants, both before the start of the program and after the end of the program. Those participants allowed us to video them while we talked with them. And shortly, we'll share with you some of their words. They've given us permission to share what they had to say to us, and we're going to take a close look at that. In addition, we conducted surveys of Moishe House housemates. We analyzed reports submitted by the mentors of the program participants, and we've been conducting interviews with Moishe House staff. There's kind of a micro picture here and a macro picture. The micro picture is really about the participants in this program. The macro picture is about a cultural shift at Moishe House, and we'll get to that shortly. Now, while gathering the data, or the data that we gathered, allows us to dig into questions that not only allow us to better understand what was happening for the participants of the Moishe House, but they raise questions that are bigger than that specific organization. It provides us an opportunity to understand what members of the Moishe House community, and I would say really anyone in North America engaged in work of Israel education and facilitating conversation about Israel, what they think makes the work of Israel programming difficult. We wouldn't be gathering today, and we didn't gather yesterday, if this work was straightforward and easy, right? There's something about this work that makes it challenging, and we want to try and make explicit what that is, because we can only improve our capacity to do the work if we first of all identify and name and unpack what it is that contributes to the challenge. Secondly, and they're really homing in now on the intervention, the program here, we want to try and identify the means by which interventions such as the 4HQ program can help educators and facilitators overcome those difficulties. So what is it that happened to the participants in this program that enables them to feel better able to facilitate conversations about Israel? So first, we're going to identify one element in the challenge, the content, Israel itself, right? I'm going to share with you in one moment a selection of videos that essentially constitute responses to a sentence completion exercise. The sentence that people were given to complete began with the words, Israel is. They could take that sentence wherever they wanted, and we're going to hear some of the things they had to say. Moshe, b'vakasha.
Israel is challenging.
Complicated.
There's so much depth. There's so many different types of people in Israel. There's so many different ideas of what Israel is.
Israel is, the first thing that comes to my mind, Israel is a complicated place. That would be the first thing that came into my head. I was thinking Israel is, what's it called? An antonym. There's so many conflicting. I think one thing we learned on this trip is that there is Israelis on every side of every issue, and the issues are very extreme issues, and even when it comes to identity, it's very divided within Israeli society.
Complicated because so many different groups of people and individuals are coexisting with conflicting narratives.
Israel is exactly what it means. Israel is debate, a struggle with God. It is
it is a wrestle. It is a place of many opinions, of dissonance yet peace, of everyone coming together and debating and arguing and talking and working through things, but at the end of the day, sitting with each other and coming together.
I would say like a mess, maybe, but like not necessarily in a pejorative way, more like balagan. Sometimes it's like a mess in a bad way, and sometimes it's a mess in like a wow, this is great kind of way.
Complex, multicultural, political entity in the Middle East that dominates the identity of Jews from the perspective of others and complicates yet enriches the Jewish identity for Jews.
Israel is stability in the Middle East.
Israel is the Jewish homeland.
Okay, so apparently Israel's quite complicated. Seriously though, first of all, let me just say, those quotes came both before and after the program. So we're giving you a sample of what some people were saying beforehand, what some people were saying afterwards. I want to clarify that. Secondly, I think, you may say, well, you haven't told me anything new here. But let me clarify, like a sentence completion exercise, Israel could have gone anywhere. Israel is far away, awfully hot in the summer, terrible at soccer. There are any number of things someone might say. These are the things that are front of mind for people thinking about their responsibilities as facilitators of conversations about Israel. And the thing that is front of mind for them is how damn complicated this context, this content is. So for us, that's kind of number one in what makes the work challenging, what makes the work of Israel education and facilitating these conversations challenging. But that isn't the only thing, right? There's also the context, right? The context in which these conversations occur. And of course, we're looking specifically at the Moishe House context. So once again, we're going to show you a video clip, but this time we're going to ask you to engage in an active listening exercise. And what we'd like you to do is post in the chat, what are you hearing people say makes this context challenging? Okay, put that in the chat box. But here are the rules of the game. You can only use 2 words to say what it is that they are describing as challenging in this context. That's number one. We don't want sentences. We don't want your thesis on what's challenging about Israel education in North America. Save that for another time. 2 words. And in addition, we're only going to let you post twice. So 2 words, maximum of 2 words each time, maximum of 2 postings. Here we go. Stop share.
So I had kind of distanced myself and not really wanted to get too into the weeds because it was uncomfortable and I didn't have a good answer to a lot of things. And I also think some people expect Jews to be able to explain Israeli politics.
I don't really talk much about Israel because I always get just lost and confused. And even when you do bring it up and you think you know something, someone always brings up some other part and you're like, great, now I just don't even know where we're going with this and what to say. So it gets very in-depth. And if you don't know about every little thing, then you basically can't continue any conversation because people always bring in 80 other aspects.
But whenever I tried to bring up Israel-related topics, it didn't get a huge support from the community, and Moishe House wasn't extraordinarily enthusiastic about the idea of running a topic about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
There's so many tricky subjects where people feel like, I don't know how to have this conversation with sensitivity, so I'm just not going to have it. And that makes me nervous because I think there's so many uncomfortable issues that we should talk about because it's the only way to ask questions and become a better person and figure out how to deal with all those things that make us so uncomfortable.
Our community really doesn't know how to talk about Israel in non-hostile ways. And so I was thinking, okay, this is professional development that sort of like fulfills that part of my job. It also will get me good experience in like an issue that is relevant to my community. And also I'm a resident of Moishe House, and you know, like we don't do any Israel programming, in part because I also feel this sort of fear of talking about it, because I know people who, you know, if Moishe House got the reputation of being like too Zionist, they would never set foot in here. Similarly, you know, if we did anything that questioned Israel, there are people who would never set foot here.
Thank you. So there's some fantastic contributions in the chat box, right? Cognitive dissonance, emotionally complicated. Feel free to keep them coming, right? Hostile transparency, others' expectations, confusing topic, extremes, confusion. Again, right? Really helpful, I think, in capturing how people feel about these things. You know, when we've really just shown you the tip of the iceberg in terms of how people reflected on these challenges. And for sure, like a consistent theme here is this sense of uncontrollable conversations, right? You know where you are when the conversation starts, but as soon as somebody poses a question to you, you'd have no idea where it's going. It's a bit like what happens when I try and have a conversation in French. I know how to do the first sentence, but after that, when they say something back to you, you're lost, right? That's what happens here, right? People are sensitive, there's hostility, and people have unreasonable expectations about what this conversation is going to yield. We're going to solve all the problems in the Middle East in this conversation in Moishe House with one another, right? The stakes seem incredibly high, the emotions run incredibly high, and the people we're asking to do this were not trained Israel educators. They are peers. So that what we got a sense there was like, there's a real delicacy or delicateness, I suppose, about being the facilitator and being the peer, the housemate, the colleague of the people that are engaged in the conversation. So like the context can be exceptionally challenging and perhaps no less challenging than the content of Israel itself. So what do you do about that? How do you bring about a constructive, engaged, authentic conversation about Israel? So the premise of the 4HQ program was that it is possible to change things. And as our team looked at the ways in which people grew through their time or during their time in the program, we kind of identified two vectors along which we perceive people to be changing. We call those vectors greater understanding and greater facility. There's a growth in people's understanding of the content, and there's a greater facility in terms of how they manage the context, right? Those are the two vectors that we're going to explore here. We're going to take a look at how people describe the greater understanding they achieved, and we're going to take a look at how people express a sense of feeling better able to facilitate these conversations. So we're going to show you in a moment a set of clips in which people talk about developing understanding. And here your task is the following. Think about what you're hearing, how people describe what contributes to greater understanding. And after the clip, we're going to ask you to contribute, not by chat, but in your real voice. We call on you, you can raise your hand. You can tell us, what are you hearing contributes to greater understanding? Before we look at the clip, just one more thing. The first clip is a bit stuttery, it freezes. Don't adjust your set. It isn't you, it was the original Zoom conversation. We wanted to show you this. It's worth persevering with this quote, even though it is a little bit bumpy. Okay, Moshe, b'vakasha.
I feel, much more informed, and therefore, because of my personality, when I'm informed, I now feel closer to it too. And then as a Jew, I also think that's helped me, because I feel some underlying responsibility for Israel. So I didn't like about myself that if someone were to ask a question, I would be like, I don't know. Whereas now there's still a lot that I don't know, but I'm not scared to talk about it.
I do feel a lot more educated coming back, and I feel like I have a lot more questions, but I also feel like I can explain what the issues are and what I have questions about a bit better. I think I'm more educated and more aware of the history and why there are the tensions there are. I think I'm more able and confident to explain the issues and to teach about the issues.
Like before, when I talked about Israel, I felt very hyped up, over emotional. I didn't know. I felt like it always was an argument, and I couldn't be clear-headed. I couldn't have my own perspective because it became such chaos. But now, after I went on the trip, I felt like, okay, I know that there's so many perspectives, and I can understand where they're each kind of coming from.
I feel like I have a better understanding of certain complexities of Israeli society, like the fact that there are all these different groups there and different religious groups. And I think the longer I would have stayed on the trip, the more I probably would have felt like I was just learning more and more different perspectives. So I feel that I have a little bit of an inkling of the complexity, but not a full grasp of it. And in terms of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, I feel like pretty much in the same place, which is like kind of unsure about what I should believe or what's justified.
Yeah. Okay, so people talk about something shifting for them, but they talk about it in different ways. This process isn't simply about knowing more or learning more. It's kind of a metacognitive dimension to it. It's a kind of understanding what I know, knowing what I know, and knowing what I don't know, and no longer being paralyzed by recognizing the limits of my knowledge and the limits of what I'm able to do and say here. That seems to be a very significant part of this. And there's no question that knowledge does not sit discretely from emotion. There's a strong emotional dimension to the shift in understanding. It isn't that we just get smarter here. In getting smarter, the heat lowers and the emotional temperature lowers, and the sense that we can actually do something here and facilitate a conversation is significant. Okay, so this is certainly one part of what shifted in people's experience. And as I said earlier, like what we're looking at here is kind of a micro shift. And, perhaps because of what was shifting on the ground, and perhaps also because of the relationship between Makom and Moishe House as it developed over time, our team were able to observe also a shift in the broader culture of Moishe House and the receptiveness of Moishe House as an organization to having conversations of this kind about Israel, or a more complex kind about Israel, and perhaps having conversations of more complex kind about a whole variety of other issues too. We'll get to that later. So we've honed in now on greater understanding. We want to take a look at that other vector that I mentioned earlier, the sense of developing facility, developing a feeling that I can do this, right? And so the question for you now, we're not going to do a rapid feedback. This is, in a sense, an internal question for you to think about yourselves is, what are the critical components in developing greater facility? Like, what is it that people gain when feeling, yes, I can do this, when previously they weren't so sure? Okay, so we're going to take a look at one last clip. I really like saying this. Moshe, bevakasha.
I don't shy away with conversations about Israel as much. I think I try to steer them in different directions than conversations normally go. So like if commonly in the community, people are arguing about like whether or not Trump is good for Israel, like I don't steer the conversation that way. I'd much rather talk about like the nuances of immigration in Israel, which may or may not further like a global geopolitical conversation or not, but like I don't really care about that as much. And in some ways I would say like I don't feel like I can make a difference in the outcomes of the situation in Israel. But I do feel like I can make a difference in the rhetoric of my peers and making people feel supported in like not needing to have a polarized opinion, and not needing to band up with the right or the left, because there is nothing that's right or left. It's more complicated than that. And I think the program gave me confidence that I was right to think that there is nothing right about the story for Israel.
Because I know I've done it now. So I know I can. I know that I can come up with discussion questions and choose some focal point, like a story or film or topic, and just help guide it along.
Yeah, that's what I'm basically saying. It allowed me to come up with pointed questions, to come up with a strategy to push people past that point of comfortability, but also keep it contained and uplifting, which is hard to do when you talk about Israel.
I came more at the conversations with a stronger perspective, and occasionally it wasn't conducive for conversation if you have a strong opinion about something. I think I've been better after the trip. I was more open, I think, to hearing perspectives, even if they conflicted with my own perspective. I was able to sit back and listen and hear through the whole thing before I kind of rebutted them, or not even rebutted, but responded. I think previously I saw it very much as a rebuttal. Now I definitely see it more as a response.
To be an educator, you have to have a very strong handle of content, which if you've heard how I described people on the trip, you're already sort of at a disservice to do that kind of work, because the people who you're asking to be educators aren't necessarily educated on the various, subjects. So people know how to hold space, people know how to bring people together, people know how to maybe even have like interesting conversations, but they don't really know how to teach, and I don't think they should be asked to.
Ta-da. Okay, that last comment is something that we're really going to return to here, this challenge of what does it mean if the people you're giving responsibility to lead these conversations think of themselves more as facilitators rather than educators. If their profile is not that of a professional educator, clearly that is something of a challenge. Okay, so hopefully what you've got a sense of here is there's a shift from, in a sense, it's like being prepared to let go a little bit, right? You don't have to rebut everything that you disagree with. There's a difference between a rebuttal and a response, right? It's about holding the space. It's about developing pedagogic techniques and strategies that enable you to facilitate the conversation and not feel that you have to drive that conversation to a particular place and know everything about all the topics that come up in that conversation. Okay, so we've talked about greater understanding and we've talked about greater facility. But we think these, growth along these two vectors presents designers of programming with something of a challenge, what we're calling the programmer's dilemma. You have people who don't have much understanding and they don't have much facility. They kind of live in the twilight zone. And you're hoping those people are not going to be leading our conversations about Israel education. We're not going to get very far there, okay? Now, if you have your people who have developed understanding and developed facility, well, they're in the optimal zone, and fantastic. We want as many of them as possible. But in the real world in which we live and the experiences in which we participate don't necessarily enable us to develop both greater understanding and greater facility. If we're managing a program and we want to call on folks to facilitate for us, what do we do about the folks who, or the members of our team who operate in those two other zones, right? But the one zone where they have a good deal of understanding, but not such great facility, or they're really skilled when it comes to managing conversations, moving conversations forward, but they don't really know so much about the topic. we think this is an issue that is increasingly challenging the Jewish community, many educational communities in the COVID era and probably beyond it, when organizations are letting go of professionals and asking volunteers to step up. Well, Moishe House has been wrestling, I'll use that word too, has been dealing with this challenge for quite a while. So in a moment, we're going to break up into smaller groups to explore the following 3 questions that we think are suggested by these videos. First of all, when you get to your breakout group, we're going to ask you to consider what, if anything, talk about, what, if anything, was surprising about these videos. Secondly, where do you stand in relation to that programmer's dilemma, the intersection of understanding and facility? And thirdly, what insight do you derive from these videos about what's possible in Israel engagement work among adults? Hopefully there's something in this material that is universal, or at least speaks to the different contexts in which the people with us today are engaged in the work of Israel education. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Just briefly, before we head into the break, I wanted to share a bit of, why this was interesting for Moishe House in the first place, as it's, coming up for folks, and we've been talking about for an hour. This is clearly a challenging, complex, nuanced, pick your word kind of topic to dive into. And, when the program was initially being conceptualized and built about 3.5 years ago, the United States was in a new and different political place. And there was a growing, palpable sense of this now ubiquitously spoken about polarization. But that, that was sort of new a couple years ago, this growing sense that that's how it was. And Moishe House residents and hosts around the country were telling us that, it was difficult if you invited 2 people over to your house for Shabbat dinner and you found yourself sitting next to someone with whom you did not agree on any topic, whether it be gun rights or race in America or anything like that. If you 2 got into it over dinner, it was unlikely that you finished the evening by exchanging numbers and making plans to go bowling later in the week. And that felt, that felt kind of sad and unfortunate. And I myself started to look around at my own peers and my own community in life. And I came to realize that the only people in my life, really, that I disagree with vehemently and yet love so much that I would do anything for them were my parents' friends. Older than me folks. And it was really suggestive that, there was some skill or some ability that, the generation above me had that my peers and I were lacking, which is like, how do we build community across lines of difference instead of letting it tear us apart? And on the one hand, it's something that my friends and I will all tell you that we want, right? We want it very much. Communities of diversity in not just how we look, but of opinion, but clearly don't know how to build it, how to welcome it, how to hold space for it. And for me personally, and I think for a lot of us who participated, that's what this project really became about. Israel became the medium through which we could delve into that heat and really feel it, because it's so visceral for so many of us. It's so easy to tap into that emotional space, and then harder to start unwinding it and understanding it, and to really make room for all that complexity. So I hope that gives you a little bit more context as to why, this experiment, this pilot, this new project is so interesting to us, and why we feel it has such potential impact on the future the future participants and residents of Moishe House across the country.
Hello, folks. To get us back in the mood, if we're remembering where we left things just before the break, that tense moment where we'd acknowledged that that Israel's kind of complicated, that the ability to deal with complicated questions within a Moishe House arena and within North America altogether is kind of complicated, and how we deal with these kind of things and how we look for that blend between an ability to hold the conversation and also having information. Just to start us off, we're going to listen to a piece of spoken word poetry that was created by Jake Sullivan, who was on cohort 1. This is this is something which Jake apparently wrote while he was on the trip. Remembering that the trip was part of an entire year's worth of input, but even on the trip, you know, folks been on the trip had been to the settlements in Judea and Samaria, had been to refugee camps in the West Bank, had met with Ethiopian Israelis, with a Mizrahi radical spoken word poet. In cohort 2, they also did a whole load of stuff about the elections, interviewed people about their electoral plans both in South Tel Aviv and in North Tel Aviv, and compared and contrasted. And one night, I guess when he wasn't able to sleep, Jake came up with this poem that we filmed at the retreat a few months following the Israel trip. Moishe.
So let's get going.
Ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Too many answers. Here is where Hanukkah happened, not in a story, but right there, down there, so now all stories are real. Too many questions, starting 3,000 years ago. No, wait, this morning. I'm mourning the loss of my ignorance and the simplicity gone with it. Here, on a street in East Jerusalem, I startle awake and feel like I'm in another country, feel out of place, don't recognize these signs in Arabic, these clothes I see around me, feel eyes on me, and wonder for the first time, what if there were no Israel? Night before at the Kotel, stirring ancient memories of birthright bus blues and singing soldiers. I'm older, but the place doesn't change. These faces around, these cobblestone tiles. And on the plane I took from Toronto to Tel Aviv, everyone around me was like a character from sometime in my past. Young religious couple with a toddler and stuffed raccoon toy. Old bearded men opening the over-seat compartments to wrap to fill in. My seat neighbors from Detroit. New York accents floating down the aisle. Is it a luxury to feel that familiar? Too many questions. We wrestle, collecting stories and stretching and breaking them like a mortar and pestle, or else we'll chew them, digesting and spitting out whatever feels too much like shtick. It becomes clear that names matter a great deal. What do you call an attack? Is that terror or desperate self-defense in the face of fences and walls? It calls to mind other names too. Two-state solution, state of mind, rewind, give me a state or make me a citizen. What do you do when both choices make you choke? What will you learn? What can you take in? At the educational bookshop, I see a map with 1948 borders and soldiers. Are they kids or symbols or both, wrapped in green cloth? Want to shake it off, but the input keeps coming. Shout-outs on the bus and icebreakers or a brief reprieve, but don't get cocky and try to breathe or think that these stories will leave your mind. How the hell am I going to take this home? In Beit Horon, I asked Karen without thinking if she had ever been there. No, she replied. And I don't plan on coming back. Look at this. Constant war. And for what? Some land? This from a sergeant of 60 who watched the border day and night. And yet I think back to strategic depth. Go deeper. Too many questions. We started with 4, but now there are more. Too many to hold in mind. Be kind and listen. That's all we can do for now. And each night I see new layers to those around me. Show me more. I like the real you. Give me more. I want it all. I'm enthralled. I'm all ears. I was here. Left my nose blood on the old stones of a leper colony. That's the kind of weird, unimaginable shit that happens every day. Okay. Voices shatter what I know. I grow, hopefully, shed my skin and go forward, onward, to drink in the next story, get back on that bus and listen harder than I ever have.
That was Jake. That was Jake Sullivan. We also met him on the videos presented by Alex. So What I'd like to do now is to share with you folks 4 of the key questions, the ponderings that we were working through during the trip and during the work. And we're now coming towards the end of the project. And we're still left with these 4 questions that we have ideas about, but we want to share with you and hear from you in your responses to what we've pinpointed. So let me share with you my PowerPoint, and we'll get started. So 4 things to ponder on. One of the things that we first came across, this was in the first year. This was myself and Johnny Ariel. Johnny and I also worked the second trip. By then, Abby was with us. And in particular, we were being taught as we went along, in particular by Megan, who was theoretically, or we were told was somebody who was doing the organizing stuff, but she actually has an incredible brain and analytical mind, together with Roe and also our 4 mentors who are working with the folks in smaller groups. So Lauren and Becca and Yitzhak and Jamie were with us. And they all told us this thing that Johnny and I didn't know about called community guidelines. I mean, bear in mind, Johnny and I are both of us over 50, both of us from Britain and from Israel. We didn't fully get the sensitivities of working with what I think I'm going to say is this generation. We were told that then we must lay down some community guidelines, ways to allow people to feel safe about expressing themselves in a group setting. We had to write it up on a board. First of all, speak from the I, as in you're not allowed to say something about you. You know how you always do such and such, or you end up feeling. No, it has to be from the I end up feeling. I can't assume that my feeling is the same as your feeling. We were told that we had to watch out with ouch and oops. Ouch and oops is this sort of code for if someone in the group has said something that upset me, and I don't need to deal with it right now, but I will need to deal with it afterwards, I say ouch, and the person who has upset me in response says oops, i.e. accepting responsibility for having said something. And for both of you, it's this code for let's just mark this point and we'll talk about it afterwards so that the conversation can continue. Take space or make space, or in the less ableist version, step in, step out. This idea that you need to be generous with your ideas. You need to be generous with your opinions. Let us know what you're thinking, but at the same time, don't entirely commandeer the entire conversation. Let others speak for themselves as well. And finally, don't assume knowledge. And there are many other community guidelines that we were told needed to be added, but this was another one which stuck out. Don't assume that when you're talking about a particular topic that other people share your knowledge. And Johnny and I were looking to each other and saying, I don't know how this is going to work. And we ended up sort of butting heads with both the participants and with the folks working in Moishe House, who are telling us this is absolutely required in order for people to feel okay in this strange environment. And we were saying, but if we have these rules in place, we'll never be able to have an honest conversation about Israel. See, because first of all, we're looking at speaking from the I. I'm sorry, we just had to get Bob Sfog in there. So Bob Sfog in Hebrew, Bob's SpongeBob. Speaking from the I means that I must assume that I have no connection to the we, to the collective. And how can we talk about Israel, which is so much ensconced in the collective and emerges from the Jewish people, not Jewish persons? How do we speak from the I about something which is so collective? Ouch and oops, we were thinking, like, if you have an honest conversation about Israel, you're going to be upsetting people all the time. And we'll never be able to get anything done because everyone's going to be ouching and oopsing all the time. Taking space and making space, that made sense to us. That was fine. But we also had a concern about don't assume knowledge, because then what is any kind of conversation or any kind of disagreement if we don't assume that we have some shared knowledge? To an extent, we also worked on that for the second cohort in that we created a 100 question multiple choice quiz about Israel, covering the areas of the 4 Hatikva questions, so that we knew that everybody had reached a particular level and we could assume their knowledge. But at the same time, we had this feeling that these community guidelines were a paradigm which was just not going to work if you want honest, deep, in-depth conversation about Israel. And that was when, by the time we reached the second cohort, we realized that what we were looking at was that these community guidelines are crucial if you don't know each other. They're crucial, for example, in many, many programs at Moishe House, when people are arriving that you've never necessarily met before, and you're not sure whether they'll be around next time. So for a first meeting, trying to have a conversation about something, for a first time, it makes a lot of sense to have these guidelines, these things which make us safe. But what happens with the next conversation and the next conversation? What happens if you're working with friends? What happens if you're in a longer term process like this process was between Makom and Moishe House? Then it felt like these community guidelines were going to strangle the possibility for, let's call it, awkward growth. So we came up with, for the second cohort, these stretch statements, the idea that we're moving into a conversation which will stretch us, possibly, probably, uncomfortably at various points. But first of all, we put down this rule: everyone is allowed to change their minds. And in fact, they're allowed to forget or even ignore the last stand that they took, to allow us all to realize we are all growing. We are all learning stuff, and we're allowed to change our mind. You can't, as in we were trying to move beyond the online assumptions that I can check what you said 7 years ago and hold it against you. No, we couldn't even hold against you what you said 7 minutes ago. You're allowed to experiment with your thoughts and opinions. Second idea was this idea of going to visit other people's opinions. This is from Hannah Arendt, from Lisa Jane Dish. While you're visiting someone else's opinion, behave like a nice guest, because you're always free to go home to your own opinions whenever you want. Okay, so this is an idea that I can listen to the horrific thing that you're saying and imagine that I'm in your front room. I'm not going to break your best tea set. When I go home, I can breathe and come back to myself. We encourage people to be bold, that diversity of opinions is one of the hardest and most enriching of diversities, as Roe talked so poignantly about just before the break. And this final stretch statement: dare to assume everyone in the group will end up as your good friend in the Israeli sense. Now, obviously, this is a romanticization and a generalization of Israeli society, but my experience with Israelis has been generally that it's not until I've had a very fiery argument with somebody that they then feel that they can be my good friend. As in England, I don't know about how it is in North America, but in England, if you have an argument with somebody, a real screaming match, that's the end of your friendship. You'll never see each other ever again. And in Israel, it seems to be that once you've had the screaming match, then you end up being friends. So we were suggesting to people that even if you have a screaming match with someone, it'll be okay. So we worked with these stretch statements, and we're left with one of the 4 ponders. How can we allow for awkward growth? Is it possible to allow for awkward growth, in particular with this generation, and in particular when talking about Israel? Second ponder. This is how Moishe House hang. You see, they're all smiling. They tend to enjoy themselves. They then tend to relate to one another. They're engaged in Jewish programming and Jewish activity of their choice, and they're enjoying themselves. And we, Makom, came in and said, yeah, that's fine. You know, we don't want to change anything. We're just going to introduce an extra little bit. Don't let it worry you. No, keep smiling, but we just want you to also deal with something which is as we know, and as you've told us, is incredibly complicated. And we're left with this sort of this idea that in educational terms, the Hawkins couple talked about moving from I, thou, this intimate dialogue between two peers, and now it's basically insisting that we add in a third corner to a triangle, and that we're bringing into a subject matter into this intimate conversation between two human beings. And how does that work without spoiling things? And in particular, when we want it to be a thou as well. We want you to get intimate with Israel. I know it's sad. I spent an hour trying to get a smiling Israel flag in there. But the question is two's company, is three a crowd? Is this challenging things too much within the culture of Moishe House, or within the culture of a great deal of peer-to-peer engagement? How do you do peer-to-peer when you also have to introduce a subject? Two's company, three's a crowd. Third ponder. Arguments for Israel, Israel for arguments. Which comes first? Which is the chicken and which is the egg? What we began to find was that with both cohorts, these are leaders in their community. These are people who are not wilting roses. These are people who know what they're doing. When it came to having an argument, it was very, very difficult. There was a great deal of concern, fear. We heard these people in the videos that Alex was showing us. And we weren't sure, in order to solve this challenge, did we need to first kind of give people practice and tools to have disagreements in order to learn about Israel? Or did it go the other way around? If we got people learning about Israel, would this give them the tools or even the motivation to have arguments? And what began to develop even further was that as the Moishe House world began to embrace this idea of having deep, tough conversations which might lead to disagreements and arguments, that actually maybe that's the most important thing to be found in this project. And then then arose the question of what's the end destination of this move, of this organizational change which is coming upon Moishe House? Are we aiming for Israel education, Israel engagement, or are we aiming to work on the value and practice of constructive disagreement? And that it might be that for Moishe House, it might even be more important for them to deal with disagreements than to deal with Israel. And at the same time, is it even possible to deal with Israel if you're not capable of holding disagreements? So that's ponder number 3, stretching conversations through Israel, like Israel is a means, or Israel the end, or are discussions altogether, disagreements the aim? And the final ponder, are we asking too much of the people that we're working with? This is a reminder of the final comment made by one of the participants in the final video by Alex. We are talking about people working in Moishe House. And even that's not quite fair. The people who are doing the programming in the houses, in the Moishe House Without Walls, in the pods, these are people who are not full-timers. It's not their job. And we are asking a great deal of them. They need to be social conveners. They also need to be educators to an extent. They also need to be now argument facilitators, which may be something different from a different kind of facilitation. They need to be knowledgeable experts about Israel. They also need to be change agents, even cultural change agents. And at the same time, they need to have a life. They have jobs, and it's in their spare time that they are doing this work. And as we know, as the corona economy, the COVID economy, is going to be hitting all sorts of Jewish institutions across the world, and in North America in particular, the idea that we're going to be able to always have full-time, well-paid professionals doing this work may well not be sustainable. And as we move more and more to what we might call paraprofessionals or part-timers or volunteers or activists. Is this asking too much? Is this going to be possible for somebody who's not doing it full-time to be able to crack? And it might be worthwhile taking a look at different models of the ways that we can work with volunteers, with part-timers in different models. So looking over to the Christian church, Rick Warren in The Purpose-Driven Church talks about the different concentric circles of the way in which each circle works concentratedly with the next circle, but there are also ways in which for different rings to connect to the core at the same time. We need to be looking at additional models, perhaps. So we're left with these 4 ponders, all right? How can we allow for awkward growth? Can we allow for awkward growth? 2 is a company, 3 is a crowd, adding in subject matter to an intimate conversation. A stretching conversation through Israel. Do we need Israel? Do we need to deal with arguments? And are we asking too much? As you could see, this was a learning process. We went on a 3-year journey with 2 very different organizations working on how they could bring their strengths together. And it may not be by chance that we're talking about the value of disagreement and argument, because there were disagreements along the way. And I just wanted to give a really, really big thanks to Stephen Green in particular and Jim Joseph Foundation in general, who held our feet to the fire or something, but just made sure that we kept working on synthesizing and pulling out our different strengths rather than the way that different things can go. And also operated the way that foundations and that funders sometimes don't, in that when we came to Stephen with a problem, he didn't freak out and say, "Oh, quick, give me my money back," but actually worked with us to see how we could make things work. And it was a rare and a wonderful thing. He brought us in we had monthly meetings, and they've probably been that we ended up really looking forward to those hours, because we ended up actually even having fun working together. And it's a rare thing, and big credit and big thanks for that.
So as you heard, this process has been an incredible learning experience for all of us, obviously for the participants, but also for us at Makom as educators. We are very excited to announce that 2 things. One, the Jim Joseph Foundation did something very interesting, and something that frustrated me at the beginning, but actually it's obvious to me now that they were right. They created a grant pool that was a limited time only, non-renewable. I got many emails saying this is non-renewable, so don't ask. And they also really helped us make sure that the project would continue. And so the Schusterman Foundation is funding Moishe House. Moishe House actually, this time they said, we want to continue. We're going to go insert, get funds to do this. And Moishe House applied for funding to the Schusterman Foundation, who will be continuing this project with us. It was supposed to launch already, but of course, because of COVID, it hasn't, and we've decided to actually wait and not just do stuff online, but actually we really do think that the trip to Israel is pretty critical to the experience. And so we hope to launch that soon. It will be an international cohort, so the growth won't necessarily be in size, at least in this first year, but will be not just focused on North America, but also on people from all over the world, which you can imagine will raise a whole new series of questions, which will be exciting for us to work on. The other development is that we are thinking a lot about argument. You might have got there. Argument, if you don't like the word argument, civil discourse, conversation. We're thinking about that question, as Joey mentioned, but what do we call it? But we are working a lot on how do we teach people to have deep conversations with each other. And a lot of the questions that Robbie raised, right? Is it about Israel? Is it about conversation? Where do we start, et cetera? So we're doing a bunch of research. We're going to be running a few, I don't know what we're calling them, research focus groups with experts on the subject. We're we'll then get to the stage of creating trainings. We're already actually writing a series of stories. Robbie and I have been working on stories that we're calling For the Sake of Argument. That's our placeholder name. With animated versions of the stories, literally stories to argue over, which have, among the questions that were asked, at least in the group I was in, was, well, how do we make sure that people who are arguing or having conversation have enough information, right? So that's one of the questions, at least through the exercise of writing the stories, of what information you need to include in a story to see that if people, to help people argue and have the same information, et cetera. So we're playing a lot with this to see where it will go and to see, if this is something that can develop even beyond this particular project. But we really think that we're onto something here. And of course, we are very open to continuing to create more trainings like this for other populations. The question of lay or non-professionals or paraprofessionals, if you want to think of Moishe Hausers that way. And do we train more of them? Are there other groups, youth movements, et cetera, that could use similar training? Or do we focus more on professionals, or do we do both? And so we're really excited to have those conversations with all of you and your friends and colleagues. So with that, I am very happy to give you 10 minutes back in your day. And I really want to thank you. And again, thank you to the Jim Joseph Foundation for making all of this possible. Shout out to Stephen Green, who hung in there for the call, even though he's heard most of this before. And thanks to Rosov for their excellent evaluation work. And if you saw in my chat, I put a survey for you to quickly fill out, give us some feedback, but you'll also, if you let us know that you want to get the full report from Rosov Consulting, their full report, just put in your email on the survey and you will get it. With that, thanks so much. Thank you all. Have a very good morning, afternoon, and evening. Please be in touch.